Book of Nehemiah. In our last study, we were looking at the closing verses of chapter 2. We saw that as Nehemiah began his plan to build the wall, there was opposition from Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19. And Nehemiah answered them in verse 20 and said to them, "The God of heaven will give us success." It's a very wonderful example we see there of Nehemiah not desiring the cooperation or help of any of those, symbolically speaking, nominal Christians, or of those who were carnally minded. He said, "God will help us, and therefore we, His servants, will arise and build. But you, who are carnally minded and worldly minded, have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. To build the church of Jesus Christ, we do not seek the cooperation of carnally minded believers." No, they can sit on the sidelines and observe, but to build Jerusalem, we need those who are disciples and who are spiritually minded. So there we have Nehemiah taking a clear stand as to who could participate in this work. Very often there is an attitude that if we have more people to help, that's better. No, if the quality of those who seek to do God's work is not one of purity and total commitment to the Lord, it's better not to have such people cooperating in God's work. God would rather have a few people who are totally committed than a great multitude of compromisers. And that's why Nehemiah said, "We, His servants, will build, but you have no portion, and we cannot cooperate with you in building the church, the body of Christ." And then we read in chapter 3 about the building of the wall. And we have seen that the wall speaks about separation. And we considered in our last study that each row of bricks represents the commandments of Jesus. And as row after row of bricks is put, keeping all the commandments of Jesus, teaching people to do everything that Jesus has commanded, the wall is built. And we need to see that, keep that in our mind as we study through the building of this wall, that the building of the wall is teaching people to do all the commandments of Jesus. As we read in Matthew 28 and verse 20, in the Great Commission that Jesus gave to us, to teach people to do all the commandments of Jesus. And it is this wall that has been broken down. It has not been broken down completely. The walls of Jerusalem were all broken down, means there were big gaps in it, and the height of it was not as high as it should be. And that is a picture of Babylonian Christianity that is selective about the commandments of Jesus. Got a commandment here and a commandment there, big gaps in the wall in between. But to build the walls of Jerusalem is to proclaim all the commandments of Jesus, the great ones, the small ones, everything, and to teach people to do them. So we need to keep that in mind as we continue the study of the building of the wall. And also, it's by building this high wall, which is all the commandments of Jesus, that we bring a separation between the true church and carnal Christianity or Babylonian Christianity and all the rest of the world. The height of the wall is not determined by us, it's determined by the commandments that Jesus has given. When we proclaim and teach people to do all that Jesus has commanded, then the wall will reach the right height. We don't want to make it higher than that, but we don't want to make it lower than that. All the commandments of Jesus, that's the height of the wall. And that will bring a separation between Jerusalem and all the other people who don't want all the commandments of Jesus. And we see this great opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem is primarily directed against proclaiming all the commandments of Jesus, against raising the wall to its proper height. And they are disturbed by that. And another thing I want you to see is that when this wall was built around Jerusalem, it's only then that Jerusalem could be completely secure from the attacks of the enemy. Because the purpose of a wall, just like the purpose of a wall in a fort, is to protect it from the attacks of the enemy. And so we see that Jesus has given us commandments, and if we keep all of them, they become not only a wall of separation between us and Babylon, but also a wall of security that protects us from Satan's attacks. And that's why you find so many Christians who are open to Satan's attacks, because they haven't taken all the commandments of Jesus seriously. This wall is our security. So when the wall is built, there you have separation, and there you have security. And of course the wall has gates. We know that Jerusalem had 12 gates. And the New Jerusalem also, you read in Revelation 21, has 12 gates. And 10 of those gates are mentioned here in Nehemiah chapter 3, and 2 others are mentioned later on in the book of Nehemiah. That's just by way of information. And these gates have got various names. They're called the sheep gate, verse 1 of chapter 3. Another gate's called the fish gate in chapter 3, verse 3. And of course, these possibly have some symbolic meanings, but it's very easy, particularly if you've got the brethren type of thinking, to interpret all these in various symbols, and then we can be very fanciful in our interpretation of all the meanings of these gates without any spiritual profit to our own life at all. It's a very dangerous thing to study the Old Testament in types and symbols without it having any practical application in our daily life. And of course, 2 people will interpret the same gates in 2 different ways. Now, we don't want to go into all that fanciful interpretation to display human cleverness, but we want to pour out our soul to death and hear the voice of the Spirit here, and try to get some spiritual lessons out of the building of the gates and the wall described in Nehemiah chapter 3. First of all, we read that the first person who is mentioned, who begins the building of the wall, is the high priest. And that's a good example in building the body of Christ and the walls of Jerusalem. That the greatest, what did Jesus say he should become? The servant of all. And that's how it must be. Now, that's not true in Babylon. In Babylon, you don't find the king of Babylon going down and dirtying his hands building a wall. But in Jerusalem, the high priest, who is the leader, is the person who begins the building. He works with his hands. He doesn't just order people around. He works with his hands. And it says here, Eliashib, the high priest, chapter 3, verse 1, with his brothers, who were all priests, built the sheep gate. They consecrated it and hung its doors. They consecrated the wall to the Tower of the 100 and the Tower of Hananel. It's very interesting that the building of the wall begins with the sheep gate, and that, of course, speaks of the cross. Jesus, when he was taken to the cross, like a sheep led to his shearers, was dumb. We read that in Isaiah 53 and verse 7. We also read in Romans 8:36 that we are also led like sheep to the slaughter all day. I just mentioned that in passing, that the work of building the wall begins with the message of the cross. And it's very interesting that when the wall is completed, in the last verse of Nehemiah 3, not the wall is completed, the chapter, the end of the chapter, it ends also with the sheep gate. It's all the way around from the sheep gate to the sheep gate, from the cross to the cross. And that is how the body of Christ is built, and the walls are built in Jerusalem. And so we see here, there is no such thing as full-time workers and non-full-time workers in this chapter. You find that the high priests are mixed with the people, businessmen, and the others in secular jobs, and the rulers. They're all mixed up together, and there is no distinction between one group and another. This is quite unique, because in the Old Testament, the high priest had certain jobs, and the others had other jobs. But when it came to this building of the wall, they're all down at the same level. And it's very important to maintain this equality in the body of Christ, that there is no such thing as a full-time worker being a special brother in the church. That's a lot of garbage that needs to be thrown outside through the dung gate outside Jerusalem. And we need to come back to the teaching of what we see here in Nehemiah chapter 3, that everybody's down at the same level. And we see here in verse 2, and next to him. And I want you to notice that phrase, next to him, because it occurs a number of times. Notice in verse 4, next to them, next to him, next to him. Again in verse 5, next to him. Verse 7, next to them. And verse 8, and verse 10, and verse 12, and 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. You find this phrase, after him, next to him, verse 27, 29, 30, 31. Right through till the end of the chapter, you find one phrase, next to him, next to them, next to him, next to them. In other words, there was such close cooperation there. There were no gaps, either in the building of the wall or in these people who were working together. And that requires some degree of an experience of the cross in our life, because we know that human nature is such that we like to choose the people we work with. And you may find in the church, in a particular responsibility that God gives you, you are placed along with a brother whom you do not naturally like to work with in that particular job. And then it is very evident whether we have cleansed ourselves of this Babylonian spirit of choosing whom we work with, whether we are willing to die and work with anybody whom God has chosen to put with us in that particular task in the church. And there, if we do not know the cross, we cannot have this experience of next to him. We've got to get victory over all our personal differences and dislikes. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of it in our flesh. There's a lot of it in our flesh. I don't like to work with this brother. I'd like to go to the other corner of the wall where a good friend of mine is working, and let me work with him. But God has put you next to this brother here. You've got to humble yourself, brother. And more than humble yourself, you've got to die if you want to work in the place which God has appointed for you in the wall. And on this side is a brother whom you don't particularly like. All your friends are on the other side of the wall, in the other corner. And God's put you here with 2 or 3 people in a particular task. And if you stick to it, you'll become a spiritual man. If you leave it and run off to join your friends, you'll remain a carnal Christian even after 25 years. And that's the condition of a lot of Christians today, because they haven't learned to die in order to work together with anyone that God puts next to them in a particular task appointed for them in the church. And so that's a very important phrase that occurs right through the chapter, and we can see its practical application in our daily life as we work together in the body of Christ. That we get rid of all these personal preferences and die. And don't choose the way of Adam, but the way of Christ, which is the way of death. Death to all our personal likes and dislikes and personal preferences, particularly in whom we fellowship with and work with. And also, this could be a picture when we see the wall as the commandments of Jesus. Each person working together, laying courses of bricks, is a picture of how it must be in the body of Christ, where each brother and sister contributes their portion to building this wall, exhorting one another daily. It says in Hebrews 3:13. When you come together, exhort one another, encourage one another. That is what they were doing. Building the wall, the commandments of Jesus, each person contributing a few bricks and building up the wall. And that is how true body ministry is, as it's described in 1 Corinthians 14, where all prophesy. This idea of one pastor doing all the ministry is another thing we got to throw out of the dung gate if we want to build the body of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 14 it says, you may all prophesy and get up and exhort one another so that we can build the wall high and Jerusalem can be secure and separated. That we need to see our responsibility there and thus make sure the wall has got no gaps. Do you know what happens when you say, Lord, I don't want to work with this person, I'd like to go to the other corner? What happens is, you're not able to do anything in the other corner in any case, because God hasn't appointed that place for you. But the place where God has appointed for you, there's a breach in the wall. And somebody else has to do your job because you were irresponsible and you were not willing to work with the brothers whom God put next to you in that task in the church. And so we see that it is because of the failure of so many believers who are not willing to be in the place that God has appointed for them, that they neither grow spiritually themselves, and the work of God is tremendously hindered, and somebody else has to do that part of the wall which some irresponsible brother who wanted his own personal likes and preferences failed to do and wandered away to some other place. And so that's something that we need to understand and say, Lord, what is the place that you have appointed for me? Let me learn to live with the brothers and sisters. Have you found, for example, when there are different house groups meeting in different localities, how you would like to go and join another house group in some other locality because of personal preferences and likes and dislikes. You're not willing to die, you want to go where you choose. Yeah, that is just an indication of these people who won't stick in the place which God has chosen for them. They like to be where they like. And therefore we never grow spiritually because we never want to put to death this personal likes and dislikes. My brothers and sisters, a spiritual man is a man who has died to all his personal likes and dislikes concerning brothers and sisters, concerning food, concerning circumstances, concerning anything. The others are fleshly and soulish. And that's a lesson we can learn right here as we begin.